Today, we're going to dive into a story that honestly sounds like something straight out of a movie. It takes place at the height of World War II, but it's not about some new secret weapon or famous battle. No, this is about how one man, a civilian, an outcast really, used his very specific expertise to completely change the air war in the Pacific. And he did it with nothing more than an idea that went against everything the rulebook said. It's a powerful story about what happens when you dare to question the status quo.
So here's how we're going to unpack it all. We'll start with this really bizarre interruption during a simple game of checkers out in New Guinea. From there, we'll get into the background of our unlikely hero and the, frankly, dangerous idea he brought to the table. Then comes the good part, how he proved it all in the skies, how that proof completely rewrote the battlefield, and finally, what the unwritten legacy of this whole thing is. A lesson that is absolutely still relevant today.
All right, so let's set the scene. The date is June 26, 1944. We're at Hollandia Air Base in what was then Dutch New Guinea. I want you to just picture it. The air is just thick, it's humid, and the constant sound of those huge Allison engines being worked on is everywhere. And inside some makeshift rec hall, a simple game of checkers is going on.
But before we go any further, just think about this for a second. Have you ever been told something simply couldn't be done? That the rules were the rules for a very good reason and you shouldn't question them? Well, hold on to that thought, because that is exactly the mindset of the pilots in our story. Right before their entire world, everything they thought they knew about their planes was about to get flipped completely upside down.
So, you've got Lieutenant Colonel Charles McDonald. He's a top ace, just 29 years old, with 10 victories to his name, and he's just trying to focus on his checkers game. And all of a sudden, this figure just appears at the screen door. He's a civilian, kind of lanky, and definitely older than almost everyone on base. He quietly introduces himself, but McDonald doesn't quite catch the name, so he says it again. Charles Lindbergh. Yeah, that Charles Lindbergh. The most famous pilot on the planet, now a pretty controversial figure, just standing there in the middle of a combat zone, wanted to talk about how they fly their P-38 fighters.
The big question, of course, is, how in the world did Lindbergh end up here, in this remote jungle outpost? I mean, he wasn't in the military anymore. In fact, he was pretty much persona non grata back in Washington. So what was he doing here? Well, his journey to this moment really began 17 years earlier, and it was all built on one very specific, almost obsessive, skill.
See, back in 1927, when he flew across the Atlantic, everyone focused on the navigation and the sheer guts it took. But the real genius was his fuel management. He landed in Paris with 85 gallons to spare, which was just unheard of. Then, through the 30s, he worked for Pan Am, basically perfecting the art of stretching every single drop of fuel out of an engine. But then came his political clashes with President Roosevelt over the war, and he ended up resigning his military commission. When Pearl Harbor happened, they wouldn't let him back in. But his expertise, it was just too valuable to let go to waste. So he found a loophole, becoming a civilian technical representative, which is how he finally got himself to the Pacific.
And boy, was that expertise needed. The main American fighter in the Pacific was the P-38 Lightning. It's a gorgeous, twin-engine beast of a plane. But it had one massive problem: a leash. Its effective combat radius was only about 570 miles, and in the massive expanse of the Pacific Ocean, that's just not enough. It meant that crucial Japanese bases just beyond that range were untouchable. And for the pilots, it meant constantly flying home with their fuel gauges bumping on empty, which is a terrifying thought when there's nothing but open water for hundreds of miles below you.
So Lindbergh starts flying missions with these guys, just as an observer, and he immediately notices he's coming back with way more fuel than anybody else. So they ask him how he's doing it. He gets up in front of a room full of these young, skeptical combat pilots, and he proposes an idea that goes against every single thing they have ever been taught. He was literally telling them to tear a page out of the flight manual.
His idea was, on the surface, pretty simple, but to them, it was totally radical. Okay, so standard procedure was to cruise with your engine speed, your RPMs, at about 2200, and you'd run a rich fuel mixture to keep the engines cool. Lindbergh's technique was the exact opposite. He told them, drop your RPMs, way down to 1600, then lean out your fuel mixture, and to keep your speed up, you just slightly increase the manifold pressure. He was telling them to run their engines slower, leaner, and harder.
You could have heard a pin drop in that room. You really have to put yourself in their boots. From their very first day of flight school, they were drilled that this exact combination, low RPMs and high manifold pressure, a state they called running over square, would literally destroy their engines. The theory was that it put this insane strain on the pistons and the cylinders. It would cause detonation, massive overheating, and then catastrophic failure. And here's this civilian telling them to do it on purpose, thousands of miles from help, over enemy territory. The skepticism was just dripping from the walls. One pilot just came right out and said it. The idea was flat out dangerous.
But their commander, Charles McDonald, the guy from the checkers game, he saw something else. He realized Lindbergh wasn't just talking theory. He'd been flying with them, using these settings, and his plane was perfectly fine. So McDonald made a crucial call. He decided to put it to the test. It was time to see if cold, hard data could beat years of ingrained dogma.
And the attitude of the pilots was captured perfectly by Major Thomas McGuire, who was on his way to becoming America's second highest scoring ace. He was a little dismissive, sure, but he was curious. He said he just wanted to see what the old guy could do. This wasn't just about testing a technique anymore. It was about this 42-year-old civilian having to prove himself to a squadron of battle-hardened kids in their 20s.
And oh, did he prove it. Pilots started cautiously trying out the new settings, and the first thing they noticed was the sound. The engines had this deep, labored rumble that just sounded wrong, unnatural. But their eyes were absolutely glued to their instrument panels, and the gauges were telling a completely different story. The cylinder head temperatures, the #1 indicator of engine strain, they weren't just stable, they were actually running cooler than with the standard settings. The technique they were all taught was a death sentence for their planes, was perfectly safe.
And the payoff? Well, this number says it all. After one particularly long mission, 6.5 hours, Lindbergh landed his P-38 with 210 gallons of fuel still sloshing around in his tanks. For comparison, the other pilots on that same exact mission came back with their needles hovering right above empty. This wasn't some tiny improvement. This was a revolution in a cockpit. The proof was right there. It was undeniable. And just like that, the skepticism in the squadron started to melt away. Now, this was so much more than just a cool trick to save some gas. This one simple change in procedure had a massive, cascading strategic impact that rippled across the entire war in the Pacific. It fundamentally rewrote the rules of what was possible on the battlefield. I mean, just look at this chart. The P-38's effective combat radius skyrocketed from 570 miles to over 750 miles. That is a 30% increase. We're not talking about an incremental gain here. This was a strategic leap that literally redrew the map of the war. All of a sudden, hundreds of thousands of square miles of ocean and dozens of enemy bases that were once considered safe havens were now within reach.
And this created the most incredible ripple effect. First, pilots could reach targets they simply couldn't touch before. Second, they could get there, engage in a dogfight for a full 15 minutes, and still have a 1-hour fuel reserve for the trip home. That reserve was literally a lifesaver. It was the margin that allowed a pilot to get through bad weather or fix a navigation mistake or nurse a damaged plane home instead of ditching in the ocean. And strategically, it meant General MacArthur's entire island-hopping campaign could speed up. Islands that they thought they'd have to invade just to build an airfield could now just be skipped, saving thousands of lives and shortening the war by weeks, maybe even months.
Lindbergh ended up flying about 50 combat missions. He even unofficially shot down an enemy plane and was nearly killed himself before headquarters finally ordered him to go home. But his real legacy, the thing that truly mattered, wasn't his combat record. It was the powerful lesson he taught, not just about fuel, but about the very nature of innovation itself.
You see, the biggest enemy Lindbergh had to fight wasn't in the sky over New Guinea. It was right there on the ground with him. It's a force we all know, whether we realize it or not. Institutional inertia. It's that tendency for big organizations, like the military, to resist change because this is the way we've always done it. It's written in the manuals, it's drilled in during training. Lindbergh's story is a classic case study in how to overcome that inertia, not by pulling rank, but with cold, hard, undeniable data.
And that right there is the real heart of this story. The P-38s didn't get new engines, they didn't get bigger fuel tanks. The breakthrough wasn't a piece of hardware at all. It was simply a new perspective. It was a willingness to question the accepted wisdom, to look at the manual and ask, is this really the best we can do? Lindbergh proved that sometimes the greatest innovations come from understanding the tools you already have in a deeper way, not just from inventing new ones.
Which brings us right back to you. Those pilots in 1944 were taught that their limits were set in stone. They were wrong. Lindbergh showed them that the published limits, the rules in the book, are often just a starting point, not a hard boundary. So it really makes you wonder, doesn't it? What are the established rules, the accepted impossibilities in our own work, in our own lives, that are just sitting there waiting for someone to come along with a fresh perspective and rewrite them completely?